Welcome. Hi, I'm Karen Sims with the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative, and welcome to the See You Try show. I am pleased to have with me a guest from CAMS Care, Mr. Kevin Crowley, sorry. And I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a minute. But just to remind you, the Try Show is designed to increase understanding about trauma and resiliency as a part of our overall effort to make Champaign County a healing community. And the views and the opinions of our guests are always their own. Not that they're going to ever say anything that is incredibly controversial, but just in case, for the disclaimer. And I'm hoping that we can have this really rich conversation. And I'm going to spend a little time just sort of building up before I introduce Kevin. So I went through CAMS training over the summer, I think early summer, late spring of last year, as a part of some work that I do in Indiana. And as the summer unfolded, and just a number of things that have sort of happened nationally and locally, where there's been an increased conversation about suicide as a part of our commitment through the ARPA funds to address community violence, it felt like CAMS was a perfect complement to the other work that we were doing. And so we have had a few clinicians who are part of the AFIA network and some of the people who are part of our healing communities work go through CAMS over in the fall. And we have a few more slots and spaces. And I hope to introduce more people to this valuable resource, and in the hopes that individuals and families will see themselves maybe wanting to take advantage of it, and for providers to be also interested in learning more about it and seeing it as a resource for our community. So without further ado, Kevin, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, so where you're from and all of those good things, and maybe your role with CAMS.
Sure. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so glad that people have been finding it helpful. And thank you for having me. This is really exciting. So, hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Crowley, and I'm a clinical psychologist who's based out of Maryland and DC. And most of my job is clinical services. I get to do therapy with people, mostly adults at the moment, and some supervision of students and postdoctoral fellows who are working towards licensure. But in addition to that, I work with the organization Karen mentioned called CAMS Care, which is a specific organization that does suicide-focused trainings for professionals, behavioral health, mental health providers, people who do assessment and people who do therapy. And what's a specific evidence-based way of doing that we think connects with people really well and that can help people feel a little bit less afraid of broaching this topic, because it can feel kind of scary no matter where we are in the process. And if we can make that a little bit easier, I think it makes a huge difference.
Wow. And so one of the questions I think people are always curious about, and I'm going to have you explain exactly what CAMS is, because right when you're using acronyms, people are like, what does that mean? But what made CAMS interesting for you? And can you also explain, what does CAMS stand for?
Absolutely. Yeah, so CAMS, C as in cat, A, M as in Mary, S, is an acronym that stands for Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. And the idea with it is when we think about, suicide as a whole and how we want to connect with people and gauge it and treat it, there's a lot of different steps in the process, right? So we want to have people in the community, right? Parents, aunts, uncles, coaches, teachers, able to kind of see if something's up and know when to refer. When is it that we want to check in and ask certain questions? When do we need a professional to be able to help and make sure that this person's okay, from a safety standpoint, from a pain standpoint? How do we do that? CAMS is an approach that kind of starts at the referral. This is a thing people can refer to, that a professional can do, that involves an assessment, involves a big focus on safety, but it really centers around, once we can get to it, pain. And the idea with it is, something that a lot of evidence-based suicide-focused approaches talk about, but that CAMS very specifically emphasizes is this idea of suicide is an option that's technically on the table for anybody, right? Anybody could die by suicide at any point. And it's going to climb the option list for us when we start feeling trapped in pain, right? When we're in pain that we feel we can't live with, we feel we can't cope with, suicidal thoughts could come up, maybe suicidal behaviors. Sort of the big unifying premise of everything under the suicide umbrella, whether it's some of that passive ideation, like, well, I hope I get COVID. I hope a bus hits me. I hope I don't wake up tomorrow. There's some of the more active thoughts, like I want to kill myself, or some of the planning and attempts. The big unifying thing across all of that is somebody's in pain. And so the idea with CAMS is it's very much centered on, I want to not just see your risk, but I want to see the pain that makes suicide make sense. That's bringing it up the option list for you. And if we can do that in a way that's really collaborative and that's really focused on keeping you out of the hospital, if at all possible, we can make a huge difference in terms of moving you in the direction of a life that feels more worth living.
Wow. And I will say, from my perspective, one of the things that made CAMS unique was this collaborative approach. And collaborative means, right, that the person who's the helper and the person receiving support are really working together. As someone who was trained as a clinician, right, like typically, I don't know if the audience knows, but a lot of times, right, like there's a suicide, like a contract, like, and a whole bunch of things that seem like they were designed to be collaborative, but really can turn into sort of something pretty formalistic and not necessarily designed with, and not necessarily personalized to address my own needs, preferences, support, right? So it's not necessarily, it's like in some ways like a liability protection, not necessarily a collaborative tool. And that was one of the things that really drew me to CAMS, was that it is incredibly personalized. It is very, very individualized. And it's not just like liability prevention, not minimizing the other resources, but it really seems like you've got to spend some time helping me see myself and helping know some of my pain points, but also helping me understand what resources and also what needs to be resourced as I move forward.
I think that's beautifully said. I think it's very consistent, right? Because the idea with it is if we follow the rabbit hole a little bit and we start talking about pain, we kind of get to this inevitable endpoint of this is a really individual, personal relationship with pain, right? Suicide and the pain that's driving it is going to be really different person to person. And this is where the creator of CAMS, a psychologist named David Jobes, talks often about this being a process where if we're doing it right, it sort of feels like a meeting of experts because you are the expert on your pain. And my job is to play a little bit of catch up. And maybe I have some expertise on interventions and things we can try and where therapy could go. But it's not called AMS, it's called CAMS. And if we don't have that sense of collaboration, this really feels kind of dead in the water in terms of where we can go, how we can get there, and what can we even make of this whole process?
Love that. So I want to take one step back, because I'm sure, right, like there's been a lot written about suicide, and at least it appears in the public domain that there are a lot more conversations about suicidality, and also people who were dying by suicide. It also seems to be overlapping and intersecting with the last few years and our overall mental health crisis. Have there been thoughts or conversations about how those two might go together, or why might people be feeling more pain points in this moment? Is there an awareness about that?
Yes. My understanding is that a lot of these conversations are continuing to happen, particularly as data is coming out, right? As we're seeing data from recent years when CDC is putting out data and we're getting SAMHSA data and things like that. And so I think what we're tending to find so far is this, and if you'll indulge me really quickly, I'll just throw out a really quick piece of context. One thing that people ask me a lot about is, what are you talking about when you say suicide and suicidality? Are you talking about people who are making suicide attempts or dying by suicide? Does it also include thoughts? And I think for a question like this, it's important to kind of catch all of the stuff under the umbrella, right? The 47,000 in change people who died by suicide, CDC reported last year, up to the millions and millions more who had ideation, who may not have chosen that option, right? Millions and millions of people, adolescent, adult, experiencing serious suicidal ideation, funneling down to people who have active plans, to people who make an attempt, to people who die by suicide. And I think what we're finding, especially in the last couple of years, even broader than the last couple of years, is some of those numbers are going up.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about what could be on the table, it's a conversation that's going to be happening for a very long time because it's such a complex question. But just right on the surface, I think there's stuff that we could probably all relate to because the last couple of years have been hard, just
Yeah.
as a default, before we even get into stuff that maybe we personally experience with our families, with ourselves, with our own health. Just as a culture, it was really brutal to be in a position where suddenly, unexpectedly, we went from normal everyday life to a complete denial of a lot of things that gave us connection, that gave us value, that gave us a sense of meaning. And maybe that happened in a way that was kind of nice, like maybe it facilitated for some people more family time, more time together. But I think on the whole, it was really difficult. And if that's what we're suggesting is tied with suicide, it probably makes sense that we saw a lot more ideation or a lot more people just wondering, man, what is it like? How do I keep going like this? Is it even worth me going like this? If this is what I'm feeling and it's not ever going to go away, is it worth the cost of staying alive? So I saw a bit of an uptick in behaviors, saw a bit of an uptick in ideation, and I think definitely saw more than a bit of an uptick in just pain and
Yeah.
stress and the extent to which everybody was feeling trapped and wondering, how do I get through this when I'm feeling so burned out and I don't even know what's going to happen next?
Wow. And so I know in the work that we've been doing locally, and again, one of the reasons why we wanted to have CAMS here is when we're supporting moms or individuals who've been impacted by gun violence, it becomes one of those drivers, right? It becomes a pain point where we've heard a lot of expressions of how do I keep going? Or is it worth it? Or maybe as a parent, you've organized your life. Maybe you've had some difficulties in your own childhood and you organize your life to create something better for your child or kiddo. And then they end up dying by suicide or injured by, or not, sorry, dying by gun violence or injured in some way. And the caregivers go, well, what was it all for? What was maybe my recovery for, or my advocating for a better life? And so, trying to help them address and provide support and resources to help move through both grief, because there's some suicidal ideations that come sometimes for many people as a pain point around grief, but also around accessing resources. And so as you talk about, we've had an exponential increase in gun violence locally, we've also had more conversation with people who have just felt an overwhelming amount of pain that's felt unmanageable.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that, but unfortunately, it's not surprising because I think that those are conversations that we're having in a lot of different places all over the country. And that's sort of the tipping point for suicide in a lot of ways. Just if we just take what you just said on the pain level, right? There's a lot of things about life that are really painful just on default, right? The pain, the price of admission of love and loss before we get into other things that absolutely compound it further, like institutionalized racism, discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity. I mean, we could talk for probably 15 minutes on all of the other things that can just make life harder on a national level, on a personal level, like a terminal diagnosis, right? It's really, really tough. And we're all sort of daily in a position where we're kind of balancing the pain on the table with the connection and the value and the protective factors and just our coping.
Yeah.
And then you start getting to that point where it's like, I got this pain. And now it feels like the pain is exceeding my ability to cope. Who wouldn't feel trapped?
Yeah.
And that's sort of the big contention that we come back to is if suicide's on the table, it's not because somebody's broken, or it's not because somebody is terrible at coping. I'll tangent for a second, but take trauma, for example. If we take just general PTSD or trauma as a default, if somebody has trauma plus suicide, we're not saying you're way worse at coping with trauma than the other person who isn't. It's that there's more to the table. And you got to that point that any of us could get to when we feel trapped in pain we feel we can't cope with. And that's where that conversation of what's driving suicide for you that you just mentioned comes in, is what was that tipping point? What is it about this thing that, again, you feel you can't live with, feel you can't cope with, that takes your pain from tough, definitively tough, to that next level of I can't do it.
So I think we should probably definitely, and maybe not spend 15, but I think that question of how do those external factors, oppression, structural oppression that express it, like that show up around gender identity, around sexual orientation, around race or class, how do those factors, do you feel like, contribute to like the pain, pressure, or points? What is, so to say more, because some people are probably thinking, I never really thought about how racism or classism or homophobia or heterosexism might drive, create a pressure or an additional burden for people. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And, I want to do so, of course, under the full realization that my experience as a white guy on this is going to be limited. But what I can tell you is what I've heard from a lot of other people and what the research is pointing us in the direction of. And there's two things in particular that I'm thinking of off the cuff. One of them is a series of conversations that I had right after George Floyd's murder, when I was working with and doing some CAMS focus calls with this group out in New York that was a community mental health center that served a primarily Black identified population. And just the number of Black males coming in at that point, particularly, that they were voicing on these calls saying, even with something so blatantly horrible, I feel awful every time I go out in public. I'm terrified. And I've been thinking about, do I want to bring another person in the world to experience the same thing that I'm dealing with, that I've had to grow accustomed to, that someone like Kevin doesn't even think about?
Yeah.
Right? Like, you get to go about your day thinking about the stress of making a mortgage or whatever. And I get to go about my day thinking about, am I going to be assaulted for the color of my skin? How do we bring that in if that's tied to suicide? Or similarly, let's say, just as you mentioned, right, let's talk about specific risk factors and pain points associated with discrimination for sexual orientation or gender identity, right? If we think about someone who identifies as transgender, like a transgender man, what would that be like in terms of particular risk factors around family of origin, potentially?
Yeah.
We don't know for X individual if these things are going to play out, but we know that there are certain things that could be there, right? Family of origin issues, family of choice issues, broader discrimination, internal discomfort. And so the idea is our job, I think, in the context of suicide-focused conversations like this, is to recognize these things can be are profoundly painful. And sometimes they're just painful in ways that we just had to get used to it and we don't notice it anymore. Right? On a minor level, sort of I call it the GAD example, where one of the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder is muscle tension. But sometimes we're so anxious and so tense for so long, we just get used to it as being normal.
Yeah.
And then we use that as the new baseline. Like, I'm tense all the time and I'm not thinking about it anymore. So now I think, oh, I'm not tense because I don't feel worse than normal, when, right? sometimes we get to that point where it's just profoundly
And then you
painful.
get a massage and you're like,
What
oh,
happened? What
what?
happened? What
That's
happened?
exactly.
What happened? So if we bring this together, kind of the conversation hits this is, I need to be, and I think clinicians doing the CAMS framework want to be really aware of the fact that there are things that make life painful on a general national level that I want to be aware of and see if it applies to you personally. And I want to get your narrative around it because it may make life hard for you, but not in a way you feel you can't cope with.
Yeah.
It may make life hard for you in a way that I don't know if I can live with.
Mhm.
And that's the whole idea is, tell me about your pain beyond a box check. I want to know this for sure because it's right. And yeah, we want to call things out exactly as factually as they are. Like, of course, we want to label the fact that institutionalized racism is a thing. Discrimination based on gender identity is a thing, right? Obvious. And what does this look like for you? How do you experience this? What's the tipping point? And what is the specific flavor of pain that's unique to you and no other transgender client I might work with,
Mhm.
even if they happen to have some of the same boxes checked on, let's say, family of origin?
Yeah, I know when we're talking about trauma, we like to think about the teeter-totter, right? And we're always right there, the protective factors or resources or resiliency factors that are on one side, and then there are the vulnerability factors. And as long as things are sort of balanced, people are managing, and sometimes one little shift, right? Your best friend leaves, and all of a sudden you're teeter-totters out of balance and you're feeling under-resourced and under-supported. And although you've been managing the same level of trauma, stress, and adversity all the time, you lose a best friend or a job or a move can take your protective factors and just shift them enough that all of a sudden you feel under resources, under supported, and more symptomatology starts to express. Even though you've been functioning maybe for 20 or 30 years, but it's always that balance beam. And so, part of our work is always trying to make sure that we add more things to the resource bucket, more wellness, more resilience, more protective factors, just to kind of keep things, to keep you fortified for the life journey.
Absolutely.
So to that end, I want to sort of drift off a little bit because I want to make it clear for people about like what this is, because we're talking about it sort of abstractly. So if someone is receiving a CAMS service or support, kind of what happens. This is actually one of the things that made me super excited about it. But let's talk through like what a typical engagement, like where does it start and what does it look like? If I've never had yeah, so I don't want to give it away, but where do we start with CAMS?
You could spoil anything you want to, I promise.
Okay.
If somebody comes in, so let's say somebody is referred for CAMS or somebody is interested in CAMS, typically what's happening there is there's something going on with suicide already, typically. So we tend to start this thing at a referral because we know something's on the table, or maybe something comes out in the course of my work with somebody that puts suicide on the table. So, if somebody presents to an emergency room after a suicide attempt, and then they're getting outpatient care or even going inpatient, either direction, CAMS is used inpatient and outpatient. Let's say there's a teenager who posts on social media something like, "I can't go on like this." And a teacher is curious about what's going on, or a friend tells a teacher. Let's say there's a parent who finds out that their kiddo was cutting, and the kiddo's like, "Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time, and I hope sometimes that I go too far." There's typically something. And the lead in for CAMS is, I want to understand that with you. I essentially I set this up. This is my stylistic approach is I'll typically tell people, I know we're here to talk about suicide. Do you mind if I tell you how I think about it?
Hmm.
And I'll typically say something like this. I'll typically say, there's about 47,000 people who died by suicide last year. And we need to do a better job with prevention. We need to do a better job with improving those protocols and making it easier to access healthcare. But even when people have healthcare, they're not always letting their providers know.
Mhm.
A therapist like me or a doc or something like that, if someone's here and willing to waste time and maybe even waste money with me, they're usually not set on, I want to choose this option.
Mhm.
What they are set on is, I can't keep living like this. I can't keep feeling this pain, doing this thing, feeling stuck and waking up and miserable in my own skin. So that's what this form is. And I'll hold it up. I'll show people the form, or if I'm doing a telehealth session over video, I'll share a screen and I'll scroll down so that people can see it. It's intended to be very transparent that way. But I'll say this form is intended for me to play catch up on pain and see what it is that you feel you can't live with anymore. And then together we can look at how safely and effectively you can manage it. And we're very upfront with people around, sometimes people aren't able to manage this safely right now, and the hospital is necessary. But if there's any way at all for us to do this out of the hospital, that's a goal for me. That's really important. And the idea behind that, just in case people are curious, is there's amazing providers working in hospitals. And I think a lot of times people aren't getting the pain-driven therapy in a hospitalization that we would like, right? Because of just the sheer lack of beds compared to number of cases needed. What the more common modal experience is I come in and out with a brand new prescription in like a day, and
Yeah.
modal length of stay about a day, with psychiatric stabilization being the goal. So we can free up a bed so that somebody else who needs it can get in kind of quickly. That's not the level that we want to be staying at. We want to be getting at pain and sort of what makes life not feel worth living. So we tell people this very directly, very upfront. And if people have questions or want to talk more, I'll put the form aside or I'll stop sharing my screen, because the idea that I want to convey really clearly is that this is a form that's got a lot of evidence behind it that's really good for helping us get your pain and how safe you are. It's something for clinicians who may be watching this that are interested in the evidence, something that's got a lot of evidence. It's really well supported and it's really well received. But I'm not trying to talk to you to get a great form. The purpose of this isn't to fill this out. The purpose of this is to help me better connect with you. And so that's very upfront. And we go through a series of questions together where my job is to essentially kind of be your scribe, or maybe if we're in person where you can write. And there's some that are quantitative, like the 1 to 5s, rate your psychological pain 1 to 5. There are some that are qualitative, fill in the blanks, where you could say stuff like, not just give me that 1 to 5 hopelessness, 1 to 5. The thing I'm most hopeless about is blank.
Yeah.
Or a really powerful question that CAMS didn't come up with. It's been around for years and years, but that got incorporated. The one thing that would help me no longer feel suicidal is blank.
Mhm.
We get such powerful answers to this, whether it's something that I, as a therapist, can help you with right now. Say like, if I could get my trauma symptoms under control, if I could get my meth use locked down, something like that. We got resources, medical, psychotherapy. We got things that the problem solver in me gets excited to offer you right away. But even if you give me something that's, impossible for me in therapy to do, if you could bring my son back, going back to the case that you gave earlier, I can't do that. But it really does put a nice spotlight on, where do we need to go together? And what's that pain that if we're doing our job right, there's kind of no choice but to hit, because what's more important than something so bad it makes you feel like you can't live with it?
Yeah. I loved the fact that you explain it, and you referenced a form. And so part of the CAMS name is it's an assessment, but it's an assessment not in the checklist, as Kevin was explaining. It's an assessment as in a collaborative conversation. It really is sort of it's a structured conversation, so it's not unending, but it really is designed to sort of really help people hear themselves, articulate those pain points, help the person who's, I love your metaphor, help you catch up and understand a little bit about what my journey has been, help us understand like my present level of need, and present level of resource. And if we're in person, sometimes, right, the invitation is, hey, let's sit even in parallel where you're the scribe. And again, I'm not telling you how to answer questions. I'm really sort of bearing witness to your story and helping come up with this framework for what your journey is. And that is what makes it uniquely collaborative. So again, I think sometimes when people hear assessments, they think a form with a bunch of checklists, and it's sort of like, did you do this? Do you want this? And that sometimes helps people feel like it's impersonal. And how is that going to help you know me? But instead, this is a conversation designed to sort of really engage and sometimes allow for some of the questions a real deeper exploration in a way that's bounded.
I think that's exactly right. Especially the forms up front. These aren't something that we would send home with a client and say, bring in next time. They're not things that I'd have you fill out in the waiting room, right? There's things that we're going through together question by question, because it's all about understanding it together, seeing it from the same page. Literally, one of the things that was stressed for a long time in CAMS was sitting next to someone. And
Yeah.
I think it's still really important when we can do it. I just think that COVID times, forced our hand a little bit in ways where we saw how effective care can be, even if we don't have to. But the whole point of sitting next to it was, we're in this together, literally and metaphorically. And it was so transparent in ways that I think everybody really appreciated, because I could see exactly what you're writing. We're on the same page there. But then I think more importantly, something that came up was, you can see exactly what I'm writing too.
Yeah.
Right. There's never that sort of stereotypical, like we're talking the stereotypical experiences of, here's the assessment, I checked the box. Another experience that people have that can be sort of stereotypical, but also unfortunately true, is the therapist behind the clipboard. Like,
Yes.
did you just write down, I'm crazy and need to go to the hospital? This is terrifying, right?
Yeah.
You'll never have to worry about that,
Yeah.
because the whole thing is, this is an assessment we're doing together intentionally. And no matter who's writing, there's nothing sort of behind the scenes. Like, there's no wizard behind the curtain. It's all right there together. And we're coming to these things together to the extent that we can.
And I believe and have experienced this a little bit, is there is so much stigma with people accessing mental health services, or even talking about suicide, or trusting a provider, right? Many of our helping systems have been sources of wounding, either real or perceived, right? And it is because, particularly for people with diversity, there's an assumption, right, that many people aren't necessarily culturally responsive, or don't fully understand them, or miss them, right? Like, there are a lot of, and again, some of those have been really real grounded experience. And so the beautiful thing about a collaborative conversation, where we're really like, I'm telling you what I want, and you get a chance to reflect back, is if there's a miscue, or if I don't really understand it, or right, you can go, no, that wasn't exactly what I was meaning there, when it's a collaboration. And I think that helps make it a lot more culturally responsive. It helps challenge sometimes some biases, and implicit bias or explicit biases. And again, when I'm looking at wanting to have a service and support array that is culturally responsive and allows for a lot of diversity, having a tool that opens room for conversation, for you really to see me and to get to know a little bit more about my story, is always a resource in the array.
Totally. What I appreciate about what you said there is sort of the multiple context of stigma there, right? Because of course you're right. And this maybe even be something we want to talk about, is sort of CAMS in the context of culture.
Yeah.
Right. But when we think about real harm healthcare has done to communities, it's notable. And I think you're right in saying that a lot of this fear about what's going to happen here is very well earned.
Yeah.
I think if we even kind of step into a slightly more general thing here, I think people have found this about suicide as a topic, right? When we think about sort of discrimination in particular communities, people having really awful experiences voicing suicide.
Oh, yeah.
Like I have a client I consulted with a while ago, and this is going to be very heavily de-identified for the purpose of just ethically. Anytime I do a case, I'll swap gender, I'll swap diagnoses, I'll do all kinds of different things for the sake of protection. But this is a case of somebody who went to their college counseling center and said that they were experiencing thoughts about suicide. Roommate kind of encouraged them to come in. And the therapist reacted in one of the most shaming ways I've ever heard of, right? Sort of in some ways, a textbook example of what you never want to say to somebody. Essentially saying, what is wrong with you? How in the world have you looked at the beautiful school that you're at? What do you have to be suicidal about? I have a kid who's about your age. If they came to me and said they were suicidal, I would feel like the worst parent ever. Why don't you think about that and come back in when we can have a conversation? I mean, it's literally textbook for all kinds of myths of suicide that are wrong there, invalidating. But I think that's a huge piece of it. So much so that I have a colleague who will open trainings like this. I told him I was going to steal this from him for my trainings and not give him credit, but I got to give him credit. He opens up trainings and he'll say things to a room full of therapists like, I want you to think about the thing that you're most ashamed of. He's like, it could be that fetish you've never told your partner about. It could be the fact that you're having an affair and we can all find you lied on a job application. And he'll say, I want you to turn to the person next to you and share it. Go. And people will get visibly uncomfortable. And he'll say, well, what's the problem? The person next to you is a therapist. You know how therapists protect information. Go ahead. And people give ha ha ha. But his point in saying that is, we want to be aware of the fact that for some people coming in, that thing could be suicide.
Oh, yeah.
But it could be something that from a variety of cultural or learned lived experience reasons has become something that's deeply shameful, and they're really gambling coming in with us. Doesn't mean we have to tread too lightly or avoid going there. We do you a service saying that I want to show up with you and be here with you, and you're not going to scare me away talking about this. But I want to recognize the fact that this is a big step because you don't know me, right? Any client that comes in to meet with me, they don't know what I'll do. And dealing with that, sort of holding that together and really praising the real vulnerability that comes with sharing this, regardless of what stigma we're swimming upstream against, I think is necessary for this conversation to feel like it can actually get anywhere.
Absolutely. And especially, I think, I'm going to date myself, but within the African American community, I know for a long time, and the data, again, for a long time, there was a thought, right, that Black-bodied folks were very, very low risk for suicide, right? Like we supposedly, because we had faith traditions and culture and family and blah, blah, blah. And I think that stigma really stopped people from talking about suicide because, right, like not only were you talking about something that made you incredibly vulnerable, but also it made you somehow not Black, right? Like,
right.
And it was,
what am I doing wrong?
That's exactly right. Like, am I not strong enough? Am I not resourceful enough? Am I that somehow, right? There was some cultural betrayal, I guess it would come from even thinking about it. And there's been some data about it. It's been easier for people to think about things like homicide, right? Or death by cop or death by community involvement or death by gun violence being a much more accessible, desirable outcome, right? So I'm going to do maybe a lot more risky things because it would be harder. It would be easier for that. It would be more socially acceptable than for me to tell you I'm in a lot of pain. I've been really struggling. I'm really feeling under supported. I've got a lot of pain points and I don't know what to deal with it. And so it's just easier to act out rather than to really like tell people what I need.
Yeah, to show how weak I am.
Yeah,
totally. When if there's one thing that I could tell people on that, if there's somebody listening or a clinician or somebody who's not a clinician alike, what I would say is I don't think suicide is reflecting weakness at all.
Yeah.
Not even a little bit. I say this at pretty much every training I go to, or in every training that I lead, really, is I'll say to the therapist on the line, I'll say, if you give me 5 minutes with you, I guarantee I could come up with a circumstance where you'd be suicidal. Give me 5 minutes. And it's not because I've just done this so long that I'm an expert or anything. It's because it's a really simple equation. If you tell me the things that you value most in the world, and I take them away from you or make it impossible for you to get them, you're going to wonder if life is worth living, right? Like for me, so I have 3 daughters. Let's say my wife were taking them to a park one day and they got into a car accident, and I also happen to lose my job. I've been talking suicide prevention every day for years. You better believe it'd be on my mind. It's just the way that it works. It's not a reflection of weakness. It's a reflection of pain and resilience.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a huge piece here that goes under the radar that we're not always talking about, which is, if I'm waking up every day living in pain that I'm not sure why I should be living in, that takes a heck of a lot of grit and resilience, just as a default, especially when we start getting into things that I'm sure, Karen, you've heard, the clinicians who may be listening to this have heard, where it's like, I don't know why I'm living. I don't really have reasons for living, or I'm living for someone else. I can't do that to my mom. I can't do that to my partner, or I can't do that to my kids, something like that, right?
Yeah.
It takes so much strength to be living and not sure why you are, that for anybody to feel like I'm weak in doing this, I feel like it just couldn't be further from the truth.
Absolutely. Because it really does. It's for some folks, it's every day making a new decision. Every hour, it's making a new decision. And even if, and so I want to say this to anybody who's friends, partnered, allied with somebody who has thoughts of suicide, is even if you think that they should be content with the life that they are living or having, there are so many times internal factors because of the things that I've been through, lived, that I'm not necessarily always expressing to you, that are constant heartbreaks, that just every day for me to show up and stay regulated and stay functioning and stay engaged takes something from me. And I have to constantly stay, fortified, and I'm constantly titrating that every single day. So, because I think, right, sometimes families or teachers or loved ones or partners, they look at a life and they'll go, well, it seems like it's okay to me. And they're not aware of my own internal experience. So I could have a lot of external stuff and still have a heartbreak that I'm sort of managing and tending to all the time, which probably is a great place to segue. So if I am concerned, right, what are some of the things that tend to be offered, again, knowing that it's incredibly individualized and everybody's on their journey? What do we know about some of the things that are helpful?
Sure. That's a great question. If you don't mind, I want to I'm very excited with what you just said. I think it's so important and necessary. I just want to scaffold for 1 second and say, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that idea of what's going on for someone internally is the heart of this. Clinically in CAMS, that's my job, right? That's what I have the pleasure of doing in this individual therapy. And really the privilege is, what is that for you? But it's reflected in all kinds of stuff. Like, there's a really famous psychology researcher, a suicide focused researcher named Thomas Joyner out of Florida State, probably the preeminent suicide theorist, I would say, working right now. He's really well regarded. He's great. He has a theory on suicide pain, and one of the pieces there is perceived burden. And the whole key there is perceived. If somebody feels like I'm a burden, it doesn't matter if I could line up every loved one you have who tells you you're not. It's that perception, right? And that's exactly what you're saying. And so I think what that sets up is this really cool and really scary idea that sort of was what you segued into, which is, well, how do I know, right? Does that mean that really anybody in my life could be faking it or could be suicidal and I have no idea? I think there's a couple of things that we want to do. One of them that I think is really important and probably the foundation for all of this stuff is, do I feel comfortable asking my loved ones if I'm worried about something? And if I feel comfortable, what do I feel comfortable saying? Because one of the biggest myths out there is if I ask, it's going to put an idea in somebody's head,
Yeah.
which has been disproven time and time and time again. And there's so many, analogous examples. Like if somebody is struggling with alcohol use, if you ask them if they want to drink, are you going to make them want to drink all of a sudden? Right? No. Right? If somebody's depressed, are you going to make them depressed? No. Right? We want to ask, but I think the key is, are we able to ask in a way that actually allows for an answer?
Answer. Yeah.
Right? Like, are we able to do this in a way that's not just, hey, you're not suicidal, are you? Where it just feels like you can feel the pull in the words there of,
Like, please
I'm
say
really
no.
hoping,
Please
yeah,
say no.
please,
Right.
please say no, please, please, please. Right? I don't want to do that. And I don't want anybody feeling that, because I think the reality is asking is never a bad idea and asking is never harmful unless we're doing it in a shaming way.
Yeah.
But if we're opening up the conversation about like, hey, I'm worried, how are you? That's never a bad idea. And so then when we think about what are some things to take a look at, there's probably stuff that feels like low-hanging fruit. Like, is somebody feeling down? Is somebody feeling sad? Is somebody feeling kind of trapped or talking about life not feeling good? I'm always listening for that. Like, life isn't feeling good. I don't know when life is going to feel good again. I don't know how much longer I could go on like this, right? Certain words like that. But then there's other stuff that about 15 years ago, a bunch of suicide-focused researchers suggested as warning signs. And the idea with it was they wanted to put out something that was really like what you have for heart attacks and strokes. Like stroke, you have that really quick acronym, FAST. It's like face, arm, slurred speech, and I think it's time,
Yeah.
right? Check these things out. Something might be going on. They came up with a really clunky acronym. Is path warm, which people can look up, which is not nearly as slick or as easily remembered as FAST. But the idea is, if you were to Google it, or if you were to look it up, it's right there. And it's, can we listen for and be aware of changes in certain things? Like if we're looking with our loved ones, are we noticing changes in, I'll give you a couple. One of the S is substance use. Is somebody using substances a lot more than average? Right? Purposelessness, anxiety, agitation. Is somebody more anxiety than average? Is there a change? Is there a change in withdrawal? That's the W in warm, withdrawal. Like, are you withdrawing more? Are you feeling more hopeless? Are we seeing less of you in a way where it seems like something could be going on? There's some new ones that came up, like insomnia. Are you sleeping less? Or guilt and shame. Are you feeling guilty about stuff more than average? Something happened, right? Essentially, the idea is, I always want to check in and see, hey, what's going on for you in terms of pain, if I have any questions about it. And I want to have the foundations when I don't have questions about it of, hey, loved one, I heard this interesting thing, or I came across this thing about suicide. I think it's really interesting how they were talking about it's not weak, it's strength. And that what we need to do sort of for our loved ones and for people we care about is be willing to have that conversation about pain in a way where I'm not going to hear it as you're broken or you're a failure as a father or a mother or a loved one, but as somebody who's in pain. And maybe we can get you a little untrapped talking or with professional help.
Yeah. I love that. And so this whole process is listening deeply, having people let you know when they need help, right? Paying attention to the SOSs, conscious, unconscious, right? Explicit, behavioral, all of those things. And when they come, right, developing, so if they get a chance to work with a CAMS clinician or anybody who's a helper who can really listen, then the strategy is coming up with a plan. I often say this about like nothing's wrong with it, but like sometimes classical talk therapy is really great at processing, but doesn't get you the verb, the empowerment, the energy needed to start to the healing recovery buffer process. And so we want you to get good understanding about what those pain points are, but also have some tools. And that's the other thing I like about CAMS is depending. So maybe I do have some thoughts, the fancy word is cognitive distortions. And what I need is new thinking strategies around like myself, my pressures, how people are experiencing me, right? And I might need to really be intentional about working on it. And again, I might have spent a lot of years working on understanding the why I do it, but not necessarily have the tools to function different, respond different. Or maybe I get dysregulated, maybe I get overwhelmed by emotion. And again, I might understand the traumas, the story, how I got there, but I might not have the coping supports to like, once I get overwhelmed, to then sort of get back into my body and calm down. Or maybe I need to learn to reach out to other people. But CAMS, right, helps people design their sort of personal survival tool. And it's constantly building on a lot of different modalities to help ground and fortify people. Am I getting it right, or what am I missing?
No, I think you said that beautifully. You know, I feel like my MO in our conversation has been to do a one step forward, one step back thing.
No. I think that's really helpful.
If I could, something you said in the beginning, I think is so important on the point we were just talking, which is just how scary this is to sometimes bring up with loved ones or to bring up with providers. And just on that point, really quickly, what I would say is it totally is. And you're not doing anything wrong if you feel scared bringing something up.
Yeah.
Right. Like I say this to clinicians all the time. I'll talk about how, I've been talking suicide prevention daily for a decade, easy. But I remember being in a point where I was so scared to bring this up with clients. I had a clipboard I was kind of known for that I made a collage of questions because I knew I'd get to the point where I'd be like, and have you made a suicide attempt? Right. Where I need to jog myself. And I think that it's just part of the course is I think on the provider side, sometimes this is really scary because we want to do good work and we really want people to feel helped and like they're benefiting from our work. And we don't want to screw things up, particularly if it feels like someone's life is on the line. And it's sometimes really scary for clients to bring this up because I don't know you. Are you going to hospitalize me? Are you going to freak out or invalidate me or make me feel like I'm so bad a mental health provider can't handle me? Or sometimes for the people that we're talking to, maybe in this point about teachers, coaches, loved ones, I don't want to put an idea in your head or I might do it wrong. And I think what ends up happening is it's scary for everybody. And it doesn't have to be perfect to be loving and to be connective, right? And if we're in a position where we're kind of willing to take that step, knowing there's nothing wrong with us for being scared because we care and we want to do it right, but showing you that you're worth taking that step for because I care about you, that's I think where the magic happens. And I think you're right too when we get into the point of treatment. We're talking about pain and we're talking about really wanting to understand that pain. But I think for a lot of people, you're right on that it can only go so far, right? What's the role of techniques? Is this sort of an active thing? And the answer is yeah. When we get to the treatment side, there's sort of like a 3-step hierarchy that I think is really important for suicide work in general, but that CAMS and a lot of other suicide-focused approaches emphasize very directly, which is kind of hits safety, stabilization, pain in that order. Safety being broadly, are you okay? Are you in a position where you're not going to choose this option to hurt or kill yourself? But there's an interesting dialogue in the field right now about safety is important, but maybe safety as we're defining it now just isn't enough. Yeah. Because somebody could be safe. Let's say there's a 16-year-old who's cutting her wrists, who's running around the house unable to find something sharp and gives up after 20 minutes. She's safe, but probably not feeling in control of that crisis or like she managed it well in retrospect and probably not in a place where caregivers would be looking at that saying, oh yeah, I'm glad
That was a win.
we're done with work, right? We finished it. So there's this idea of safe. I want you to be safe. I want your environment safe, specific strategies on this. But I also want you hitting this thing of stabilization, which is I got skills, exactly as you mentioned, Karen, for challenging thoughts, for tolerating distress, for taking that step back in the moment so that if a crisis comes up, I trust my resilience. And I trust that I can navigate that peak of the peak stuff where my life is on the line. Essentially, the analogy that I use sometimes is I want people feeling like if we're at the edge of a cliff, safety could be me just holding you, right? And you can't jump if I'm holding you, if I'm strong enough. But I want you feeling like you can stand on the edge of the cliff and back yourself up.
That's right.
That's the foundation for all of these things, right? Is you're safe, but you're stable. You can hands up, step back. And then that's where pain comes in, right? Because for many of our clients, if there is that behavioral risk piece, we can get to that point. Or maybe they don't need it if it's just thinking, right? But we can get to that point and then they could feel like, well, now what? Like I'm not going to kill myself, but life still sucks. There's a difference between hands up, step back, and actively turning and walking away, right? It's the same direction. But that's where I think the pain stuff comes in. If we have that foundation and the skills and the tools for what do you do in crisis? How do we make your environment safe so that there's just less risk? But what do we do to help you skill-wise here? It's the foundation we can use to sort of diving board jump off into, I'm ready. I'm ready for that pain and to be in there with you the whole time.
And that, I know we're nearing the end, but just imagine how varied that can be for people. So for some people who the issue is, I'm feeling hopeless and disconnected, that could be leaning into a faith community or to a spiritual practice or volunteering, or right, like it could be this really robust, vibrant plan, sort of as I move towards addressing those pain points, right? So just sort of, I want people to realize like it's a process, because I think sometimes people think about right, treatment as a thing, right, like as a task, but instead it's a process. And CAMS allows for people to kind of really come up with these individualized plans, looking at the whole process. And I'm aware of the time, so I wanted to make sure that I allowed a little bit of time here at the very end for you to share any final kind of words. I will put a link to the CAMS website on the thread on Facebook, so you'll be able to find that. But is there anything else that you want to offer?
It's a good question. I think I'll offer two things. So one, just again, getting the scaffold off your amazing points. That's exactly what the treatment in CAMS is. And I think what draws a lot of clinicians to it is just the idea of once we get to that pain, it's not like one of the treatments where there's 12 sessions and every session is spelled out and you have to get cookie cutter stuff for everyone else. There's nothing wrong with cookie cutter, especially if we're sort of making it work for you, right? It's got research, it works. But for CAMS, the idea is we get to do what works for me and for you collaboratively, including non-therapy stuff, connecting with a minister, as you said. We've had people, like when we've worked with tribal nations, say they appreciate this because they could bring in holistic approaches or spiritual exercises, which is awesome. And I don't have to change who I am, who you are, what I do to connect with you, which is great. And I think in terms of wrapping up, that connection piece is probably exactly what I would land on, which is I would want to say to anybody who wanted to join in today or who happened to find this on TV or on YouTube, I want to say thank you for stopping here, because this is not the most exciting topic. This is a really tough one to listen to hear about. And if you took time to check out even part of this, I think that's really amazing, right? It speaks to you wanting to understand this and maybe feel better prepared with loved ones or with your clients or whomever. Thank you for gambling, right? For taking that jump. And if there's probably one thing, CAMS or not, you take away, I would say probably that connection piece is it, which is if we could all approach this conversation through the lens of you're not broken, you're in pain, a pain that we can all get to when we're feeling trapped, but a pain that I can sit with you in and show you by my actions that you're not broken from, I got you, like we got this, and we'll walk, get you professional resources if needed, when needed, but be here for you when not. And in addition, I think that's it.
Yeah.
I think if we have that together, it's very heady Disney movie ending, I guess. But I
No,
think
that
that's
was
it
a
is,
beautiful ending. Yeah, no, that
yeah,
was absolutely beautiful ending. And I just want to say, thanks to the City of Champagne's Blueprint for Peace. We have like trained clinicians and also have the capacity to bring in a few more clinicians trained in CAMS. And so if you are interested in learning more about receiving services locally, reach out to us. And if you want to learn more about CAMS, and maybe if you're at a practice or you're a clinician in town and want to sort of pursue it on your own, we'd love for you to sort of reach out to learn more about training and have consultation calls and all kinds of really great accessible resources. So thank you so much. Thank you for spending the hour. This was really a great conversation and hopefully a really useful resource for our community. So thank you.
thank you very much.